Good morning, everyone. Reverend John is away today, and so he asked me to fill in for him. I hope that you're managing okay as this COVID situation stretches out into the late summer and early fall. I can imagine that it's starting to seem like a long time. I remember when it first came out as a serious problem in late to mid-March, and things started to go into lockdown, and I said to myself, it'll probably just be over in a few weeks. And then a few weeks passed, and people said, well, now we're going to be into this in late June. And now here we are in late August. And maybe we'll start to taper off by late autumn. And I guess, like many, I was worried about the virus in May. And for inspiration, I started to read about my parents' experiences during the Second World War. My parents don't talk a lot about the war, but they did have to spend many nights in a bomb shelter. My sister says sleeping all those nights on the cold stone floor gave my mother a great deal of physical and mental stamina. And later on, when she was, after she emigrated to Canada, and they bought a cottage, and she'd swim across the lake back and forth. So she had a lot of physical stamina. She was a very strong woman. Another fun fact about my mom is that she would never tell me her age. Sometimes I would try to sneak it out of her. Like, we had this kind of running joke, and so we say we were talking about World War II, and I'd ask her, so how old were you when the war broke out? And then she'd reply, I was... Oh, no, you don't. You're going to do the math and figure out my age. Well, don't. Anyway, maybe in these difficult times we can derive courage and resilience by reading and learning about our family's experiences in the past. I think that helps to some degree. There are no announcements today. It's in late August. The church, there's not a lot of activities going on in the church in late August. But I would like to thank Calvin and Sandra for the work with the service, for the help with the service. And also we have a wonderful singer today, Katie Colburn, who will be doing a lovely solo for us later today. Okay, would you bow your heads with me in prayer? Okay, so the call to worship is taken from the 31st Psalm. In Thee, O Lord, do I seek refuge. Let me never be put to shame. In Thy righteousness, deliver me. Be strong, and let your heart take courage, and all you who wait for the Lord. Thank you. I'm always impressed by anyone who could play such a complicated instrument with all these pedals and stops and keys and it switches back and forth between piano and organ because the keys are different colors. The black keys are actually white and the white keys are actually black. Very good, thank you. I like to use a prayer written by Billy Graham. And some of the things I like about Billy Graham is that he was generally apolitical. And in the 1950s and 1960s, he broke down a lot of racial barriers in the United States because he refused to allow a colored section for worshipers in his assemblies. And he said, all must worship together. So here's the prayer. Today, Lord God, I remember all those Christians who have gone before me and thank you for the inspiration of their memory. May I never take for granted the heritage I have in Jesus Christ. Okay, we have 3 readings for today. The first reading is from Exodus chapter 1. So now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war befalls us, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, the Egyptians set taskmasters over the Hebrews, to afflict them with heavy burdens, and they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they made the people of Israel serve with rigor, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and all kinds of work in the field. In their work the Egyptians made them serve with rigor. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this, and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and are delivered before the midwives come to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but shall let every daughter live. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a goodly child, she hid him for 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds at the river's brink. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and lo, the babe was crying. She took pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the daughter and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, for she said, because I drew you out of the water. So the second reading is from Romans, from the 12th chapter. I appeal to you, therefore, brethren, Paul's letter to the apostles, I appeal to you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may prove what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I bid every one among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith which God has assigned him. For as in one body we have many members, and all the members do not have the same function, so we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members one of another. Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. If prophecy, in proportion to our faith; if service, in our serving; he who teaches, in his teaching; he who exhorts, in his exhortation; he who contributes, in liberality; he who gives aid, with zeal; he who does acts of mercy, with cheerfulness. And the third reading is from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 16, verses 13 to 20. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do men say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." Jesus said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the power of death shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was Christ. This is the word of the Lord. I want to start by saying, actually, I didn't think I introduced myself. My name's Edwin Bitzina. Anyway, probably know me, but anyway. I want to start by saying how happy I am to once again have this opportunity to speak to you about the biblical passages for this week. My whistle. I'm not a biblical scholar, but I enjoy these endeavors because it enables me to delve into the historical record behind the three passages and to try to align the historical record with what is found in these inspiring texts. I gave my message the title, God Calling, because I would like to delve into the theme of God calling each and every one of us to use our talents and our gifts for the greater good. God calls us even though he knows that we are not perfect. In the Bible, God calls people regardless of their station in life, regardless of whether they feel up to the task or not, regardless of whether they have flaws and foibles. And this can be a comforting thought because it made the task involved in the calling more attainable for us. Now, going against my historian's instincts, I'm going to start with Paul's epistle to the Romans rather than with a passage from Exodus, which predates it by about 1,400 years. In my mind, Paul's guidance and admonitions provide the template to apply to the other two passages. It's believed that Paul wrote the epistle to the Romans around the year 57 Common Era, a few decades after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Paul was wrapping up his ministry in the ancient Near East and wanted to take it westward first in Rome and then moving westward as far as what is now Spain. By that time, the Christian community in Rome had been in existence for a few years, and Paul was writing to them not only to ask for aid for his mission westward, but also to explain in detail his understanding of the Christian message. Alas, Paul never made it to Rome as an apostle, but as a prisoner, because he was arrested in Jerusalem shortly before his departure and brought to Rome to stand trial. So alas, Paul was never able to launch that westward mission, but he did leave us a very important epistle. And it's probably one of the most important epistles in the New Testament, not only because of its length, but also because of how it has influenced Christian thought down through the centuries, crystallizing the Christian thought and the meaning of salvation, but also providing guidelines on how to interact with the world. How does a Christian lead a Christian life while living under imperial Rome, especially during one of the reigns of those crazy Roman emperors about whom so many movies have been made, like Nero and Caligula and Communus, terrible people. I mean, not all Roman emperors were bad, but still. Paul's epistle to the Romans is noted for two key phrases, one pertaining to faith and salvation, i.e. that since we have been justified or made worthy of salvation through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Salvation is acquired through our faith. That passage was extremely important for the Protestant Reformation, a passage that expresses the idea that we acquire salvation through our faith in God's grace, rather than participating in actions or rituals that have little meaning. The other influential phrase in the epistle deals with how Christians interact with the governing authorities. Here, Paul argues that all authority on earth was divinely ordained and should be obeyed. And one might think, well, in arguing this, Paul is kind of like pandering to the Romans. But maybe that's true. And there's been so much discussion in subsequent generations about when it is right not to obey the governing authorities. Still, regardless of the problematic nature of some passages in the epistle, it certainly has a great deal of inspiring material. The passage that I read a few minutes ago does have much to inspire us to action. And at first glance, it might seem that in advocating the primacy of faith and belief in God's grace, Paul is encouraging a passive approach to spirituality. Is it true that all we have to do is believe? But this passage puts the accent on action, on using our gifts, our talents. Kind of like in the same way that the second chapter of James' epistle says that faith without works is dead. There is more required of spirituality than belief. Paul writes, having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. All members of a church community do not have the same function, but each member contributes to the whole. And I think there are two principles in the passage that help us to understand this call to action. First, to remember the quality of humility when recognizing we have God-given talents. To do our part in the community and to contribute to it does not mean feeling above others in this community, but, quote, to think with sober judgment, as Paul writes. There's kind of like a sweet spot between recognizing what our talents are and not becoming arrogant or overconfident about them. It's like when I learn a piece of piano music. Sometimes I become overconfident with the piece. Yeah, I got it. I can play that piece of music with two hands tied behind my back. I can play with my toes. And then people come over, I try to play it for them and it flops. How would that happen? Because I became overconfident. The second principle, to show our gratitude for God's grace, we are to be, quote, living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. Well, of course, it does not mean literally that we sacrifice ourselves in the same way that an animal is sacrificed in the Old Testament texts. And what would be the point of that anyway? To be a living sacrifice to God is more of a metaphor that in using our talents for the greater good, we give up things that we would rather keep. And often, action often requires sacrifice, doing something that's risky, something that we're afraid to do. Making use of our talents sometimes does indeed involve in taking great risks. And that's clearly apparent in the excerpt from the Exodus story. And here we have some unexpected individuals committing acts of great courage. There are a few theories about when the Exodus actually took place, but according to my limited knowledge of the topic, there's much consensus that the exodus of the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt took place in the 13th century before Common Era, during the reign of Ramesses II. Ramesses and the dynasty to which he belonged did much to consolidate and extend Egyptian military power, particularly around the area of the Nile Delta in the north. Ramesses II actually reminded me a bit of King Herod, in that both monarchs undertook lavish building projects, but also had a nasty streak of cruelty, particularly against newborn children. Ramesses and Herod also ruled over the Israelites as subjected peoples, enslaved or oppressed in some way to the authority of an imperial power. The passage that I read a few minutes ago recounts how Pharaoh ordered the slaughter of the newborn Hebrew male children, out of the fear that the Hebrews were growing too numerous. The newborn daughters would be allowed to live, but Pharaoh assumed that over time they would marry Egyptian men and thus be absorbed into Egyptian society. It was a nasty form of ethnic cleansing, or even genocide. The Hebrew midwives that appear in the biblical account must have known of Pharaoh's cruel orders, and they must have known too of these women must have known too of the kind of authority that Pharaoh wielded in his kingdom. Like many pharaohs, Ramesses II was ascribed divine quality in the eyes of his people. As one historian notes, a prime example of a God-incarnating king. At the time, it was believed that Ramesses II had the power to make rain fall and to withhold it at his will. I'm not sure that's true. It probably didn't work, but anyway, people believed it. That's important. So the decision of the midwives to defy Ramses' order was especially courageous because they were defying a monarch who was portrayed as semi-divine and whose authority was virtually absolute. Instead of killing the newborn male Hebrew children, the midwives saved them. To explain their actions to a baffled Pharaoh, the midwives first try to ruse to outsmart him. "Well, you see, Your Majesty, the Hebrew male children have survived because their Hebrew mothers are so strong and vigorous that they tend to give birth before we arrive. In record time, 2 minutes of labor, and out comes the baby boy." It's incredible. And God rewarded those midwives for their courage. Feeling thwarted, Pharaoh tried to circumvent the midwives by ordering that the Hebrew male children must be thrown into the Nile as soon as they are born. And yet when the baby Moses was born, his mother hid him for 3 months. And I guess you can't hide a baby forever, so after 3 months, she put the child in a basket and floated it down the Nile River, close to the shore among the bulrushes. I'm not sure exactly why she would have done that. It seems like fraught with risk. Perhaps the mother was desperate to save her child and took this one chance. Then, luckily, as we remember, the baby was discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, someone we would not expect to be open to the idea of saving a Hebrew child. She knew that it was a Hebrew male child, and she knew about the orders given by her father. And yet, this royal princess decided to save the child's life, having it nursed by a Hebrew woman who, as luck would have it, turned out to be Moses' mother. Mother and child were thus united, but the boy was raised at Pharaoh's court. Now, there's some things about the biblical account I don't understand. I mean, how did Pharaoh's daughter suddenly show up at the royal court with a male child, even if she had managed to show his true identity, to hide his true identity? I mean, didn't everyone at Pharaoh's court wonder, where did he come from, this baby? So the story does not provide all the answers. But in addition to telling us something about the early life of Moses, the account sheds light on the heroic role of women in the Bible, of which there are many. The Hebrew midwives, Pharaoh's daughter. And with Pharaoh's daughter, I was really struck by her role when I reread this passage this past week. She wasn't Hebrew, of course. She was a royal princess. She was Pharaoh's daughter. She was a pharaonic princess. Not only was she defying her father and taking a great risk, but she was doing something that really went against the grain. In the text of right down through all those centuries of Christian history, the Egyptians are often portrayed and perceived as oppressors who held the Hebrew slaves, who held the Hebrews in brutal slavery against their will. And did not African American slaves in the 19th century take inspiration from the Hebrews and their flight from Egypt? That's why we have all those wonderful African American spirituals. When Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand. Let my people go. And yet, we have a royal princess of Pharaoh's court defying her father by saving a Hebrew male child's life. And maybe the passage shows us the nuance in the biblical human experience. Sometimes I find in the Old Testament, especially in those historical books like Joshua, that there's lots of broad statements made about peoples like the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hivites, Jezebites, and so on, all of them presented as terrible and barbarous and cruel and worthy of destruction. And it's not the first time or the last time that a people has been cast in such a negative light by their enemies. And maybe it's natural, although not praiseworthy, for a people like the Israelites to demonize their enemies en masse. But there's always gray between the black and white, a middle ground, a kind of nuance between the us and them. It's impossible to generalize about a people, and there's no such thing as a barbarous race. Maybe Pharaoh's daughter is a good example of that middle ground, that nuance that qualifies the generalizations that we might make about a people. It's a powerful message, maybe unintended, but in today's world, it's a message that is worth listening to and remembering. Peter was likewise called to fulfill a very important role, to answer God's call. Maybe there was something in Peter's perceptive abilities that made him stand out in the mind of Jesus. When Jesus asked the disciples who people say that he is, the disciples describe how Jesus is perceived in the eyes of the broader public as John the Baptist or as Elijah or Jeremiah and so on. And then Jesus asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And it was Peter who answered first with the correct answer. "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And then Jesus assigns a special role to Peter when Jesus imbues him with the phrase, "You are the rock upon which I will build my church." As a funny aside, the French word for rock is pierre, or stone, I guess, which is also the French equivalent for the name Peter, but anyway. And there's been a great deal of discussion about the commission that Jesus gives to Peter. "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Now, was Peter actually given a set of keys to the kingdom of heaven? Peter, the celestial gatekeeper. And many medieval depictions of Peter literally show him carrying a set of keys. Typically large keys are this big, so you think, well, the gates of heaven must be extremely large. And the great Catholic reformer and writer Erasmus wrote a very funny text in the 16th century criticizing the very worldly Pope Julius II. Pope Julius II, in real life could be seen galloping up and down the Italian peninsula in full armor at the head of the papal army, fighting one battle after another, a pope whom it was said loved the smell of cannon smoke and the blood of battle. In the text dialogue, in Erasmus's dialogue, Julius and his whole army have just lost a battle and their lives, and thus Julius appears at the gates of heaven demanding that Peter open the door and let him in. Peter cross-examines Julius on his very worldly and morally dubious life, calls him a pest, and tells him to go away. But today, maybe our understanding of heaven is somewhat different, and keys to heaven, the kingdom of heaven, are more meant to be understood as a message of salvation. The key to salvation, the message that Peter would disseminate after Jesus' death and resurrection. A mission that facilitates the salvation of souls, giving people the path, the key to be saved. Peter was in some ways unique. He was not just a disciple, he was also an apostle. You see, a disciple can be an apostle, and an apostle can be a disciple, but a disciple was not always an apostle, and a disciple was not always an apostle. For some, apostles like Paul were not disciples, and some disciples like Jesus were not apostles. If that makes any sense. But Peter was both. He was one of Jesus' disciples, and as an apostle, he carried forward the message of salvation after Jesus' resurrection, after Jesus' death and resurrection. Tradition tells us that Peter journeyed great distances to spread Jesus' message of salvation. Peter eventually ended up in Rome to a fledgling Christian community, although I guess that church predates his arrival. Maybe it's possible that Paul read Paul's letter to the Romans, to the Roman Christians. Paul must have been an important figure in the Roman Christian community, and he paid for this with his life, suffering the ultimate penalty of crucifixion, probably during Nero's reign. Now, there are all sorts of apocryphal stories about Jesus' ministry in Rome, but suffices to say that Peter really did answer Jesus' call to bring the message of salvation to the early Christians. You're probably wondering, what was Peter actually exactly given when Jesus said to Peter that Peter would have the power to bind and loose? It seems to be one of those biblical phrases that doesn't translate well into modern English, and was probably better understood in biblical times. Binding and loosing is from the Old Testament. It refers to the rabbi's authority to determine what is proper daily behavior according to Mosaic law. Even with all those Mosaic laws, there were lots of gray areas in the application of the laws, as there really are in every law code. Law codes, religious or secular, cannot possibly address all the individual peculiarities that arise in certain situations. For example, say you're caught speeding on the Trans-Canada Highway, and you say to the police officer, "But sir, I was only going 110. That's not so bad, is it?" And then you appear before the judge, and the judge has to decide whether to apply the law strictly or loosely. Strictly, he would say, well, the law is the law, now pay your fine. Loosely, the judge would say, well, he was only 10 kilometers over the speed limit, and it's this defendant's first offense, and he was rushing home to feed his cat, and so on. In the Old Testament, it was the rabbi who had the authority to make decisions about the application of Mosaic law, this power to bind and loose, to decide on these individual cases. They're kind of like judges in a way. Jesus did this himself as well when the Pharisees tried to trip him up on these kind of spiny questions of Mosaic law, how to interpret the law and apply it. And sometimes the matter can be gravely consequential. Peter was given this authority to regulate matters of daily church life and moral conduct. So actually were the other disciples a few chapters later in the Gospel of Matthew. But binding and loosening also entails, of course, the power to forgive sins. A sinner can be exonerated and forgiven, thus so much dependent on this commission to bind and loose. But why is the text important? Much of this passage deals with what being an apostle would actually mean. But maybe, too, there is something else that we can take from the text. It's interesting that Peter, of the 12 disciples, was first to be given this role. But we know that he was a very human person. He had his foibles, and when the critical moment came to defend Jesus, to stand by Jesus' side, Peter denied him once, but 3 times. And I'm inclined to think that Jesus knew that he would do this well in advance of when it happened, but he still chose Peter. And then there's that beautiful passage at the end of the Gospel of John where Jesus forgives a weeping and penitent Peter and tells him to carry on with his mission to, quote, feed my sheep with a message of salvation. One of my favorite passages in the Bible. Jesus chose Peter even though Peter had flaws, maybe not terrible ones. What would each of us have done if we were suddenly surrounded by temple guards and Roman soldiers? We might have done the same thing. Jesus who? Who's Jesus? I don't know any Jesus. Peter's a very human person with human foibles. He didn't come from an illustrious family. He was a fisherman. His father was a fisherman. And that didn't matter to Jesus, and really, why would it? Jesus called Peter as he calls others. God knows that we have flaws, but he calls upon us nevertheless to do something for the greater good. And that's a comforting thought because it makes answering the call all the more easier. To conclude, one of the ways that we can draw inspiration from the Bible, especially in these difficult times, is by reading the accounts of these biblical characters. They inspire us in the way that they answer God's call. They inspire us with their courage to rise to the task asked of them, regardless of the consequences. The accounts of these biblical heroes add flesh and blood to the prescriptive material that we find in the epistles. These people are people we can relate to. They're not superhuman with extraordinary mental and physical capabilities. They're everyday people who answered God's call and achieved things that were well worth remembering and following.
So speaks Jesus to his followers, friends of his must learn to give. Life is ours to share with others. We are bound with all who live. Anxious people, can you hear me? I was torn and hurt by fear. Sick and suffering, maimed and wounded, I knew doubt and bitter tear. So speaks Jesus to his followers, friends of his must learn to give. Life is ours to share with others. We are bound with all who live.
Thank you so much. You have such a good voice, a beautiful tone. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yes. So now we'll go on to the pastoral prayer. You know, one of the things that I like, I love doing in Western Newfoundland is going on long bike treks on my bike. I'm not very fast, and those guys on those fancy road bikes, they just whip by me like, but I'm often on the bike the whole day, and I return in the evening, and then I do my stretches, and I have a nice meal at night, and then I also say a prayer of gratitude because I feel so grateful that I can do this. To live here in this part of the world, Newfoundland drivers are so polite. They give me, encouragement when I'm cycling up big hills. They don't cut me off or yell at me, and I feel very safe cycling here and living here. I've never been kidnapped while on my bike either. That's a good thing. So whatever your pastimes, we recognize that we are free in Western Newfoundland, in Canada. We are pretty safe too, and I pray that other peoples living in other parts of the world where this is not the case could receive God's blessing and acquire that same freedom. And I make this prayer using the words that Jesus taught us: Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, as on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who are trespassing against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. The power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Thank you for listening and thank you for coming. May your lives be blessed with meaning and fulfillment as you go to answer God's calling each and every day.